Okay. Good afternoon. I wanted to welcome everyone here to our joint informational hearing. This is a joint hearing from the chair priority button. It is on. Yeah, all the red lights are on now. Yeah, let's leave it on. Yep. We are the Assembly Committee on Business and Professions, which I am happy to chair. We are also joined today by the Assembly Committee on Health, chaired by Rob Bonta, and then the Assembly Committee on Agriculture, Chair Bill Dodd, holding the hearing today. I want to thank both Assemblymember Bonta and Dodd for co-hosting with me on this really important topic. As Chair of Business and Professions, which has regulatory oversight over many of the professional licensing bodies in California, including the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation, this discussion is very timely and relevant. The enactment of the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, which was comprised of AB 243, Mr. Wood, who joins us also, AB 266, Bonta, Cooley, Jones-Sawyer, Lackey, and Wood, and SB 643, McGuire, increases access for patients with limited care options. But the Act has also left many questions unanswered about how the legislation will proceed in practice and how it will be practically implemented. What we're hoping to hear today is really how we can identify solutions to ensure that we achieve the regulatory oversight that is promised in these bills, both for the licensees and the boards charged with professional regulation. So with that, I'm going to ask my colleagues if they also have perhaps an opening statement to make. Mr. Bonta.
Thank you, Chair Bonilla. Thank you all for attending the first hearing regarding the implementation of the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. As Chair of the Assembly Health Committee and one of the co-authors of the legislation that we passed last year, I'm very proud of the work that we've accomplished over the past year, and we certainly took a huge step forward as a state last year. It was a historic time, and very important work was accomplished, and we are now finally working towards establishing a strong regulatory framework that will protect patients, the public, and the environment, and help California become in compliance with the 2013 Cole Memo. All absolutely critical steps forward. And we have an outstanding group of expert panelists here with us today, including some from my district, so welcome and glad you're all here. And I'm excited to learn more about the progress we've made thus far and the plans for our future from the different perspectives that will be represented today, a state, local, and industry perspective. And today we have come here to learn from each other. This hearing is an opportunity to find out what else we can do from a legislative standpoint to provide the administration, locals, and businesses with the tools they need to be able to implement this landmark program well and avoid what we all want to avoid, which is unintended consequences. And it's a chance to hear about potential challenges for all parties, also an opportunity for the public to hear and provide feedback about what's to come in terms of the regulation of the medical cannabis in California. I look forward to a productive hearing with all of you.
And Mr. Dodd.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bonilla and Mr. Bonta. This hearing on the implementation of Medical Marijuana Act is important to ensure that our state agencies are moving forward with their required regulations. The Act has many moving pieces with many state agencies impacted. Today's hearing is a great start to discussion that will continue throughout the year. I look forward to hearing from our panelists and learning the progress that has been made so far in creating this new program. Thank you again, Madam Chair, for this hearing.
Well, thank you so much. Of course, the important word here is hearing. We're really here to hear from you. And to that end, we have three separate panels. The state perspective will be our first panel, and I'll ask them to go ahead and come forward at this time. Secondly, we'll have the local perspective. And finally, our third panel will be the industry perspective. So I also will remind everyone who's speaking on our panels that In these hearings, usually less is more. And we have asked you to all maintain a certain time limit. There's a reason for that. We have limited attention spans, as everyone does, and we really want to be able to hear the most important details, what the message you really want to deliver to the state legislature today on the implementation of this very important act. Thank you so much. With that, we'll begin with our state perspective, and I'll ask our Director of the Department of Consumer Affairs, Awet Kadani, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
That was perfect.
To begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Bonilla, Chair Bonta, Chair Dodd. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today regarding the new medical marijuana regulation and safety act. I am Awet Kadani, and I am the Director of the Department of Consumer Affairs. Before I go into the implementation, I want to provide this body some background and context into my Department of Consumer Affairs. As some of you may know, the primary mission of the department is consumer protection. We currently oversee 41 boards and bureaus that issue licenses in over 250 categories. With the passage of the act, my department is now responsible for establishing the Bureau of Medical Marijuana, which will license and regulate dispensaries, distributors, and transporters. In partnership with my colleagues, the Department of Food and Agriculture and the Department of Public Health, I will continue to directly oversee the formation of policy and regulations related to medical cannabis. We will work closely to implement the new act by January 1, 2018. Let's be clear, this is an aggressive timeline. And for that very reason, I asked my staff to begin the work of implementation immediately after the bills were signed. Early on, our focus has been on education. In order to fully understand the industry that the department is now mandated to regulate, we have been actively engaging our partner agencies, industry experts, and local government. Additionally, in partnership with the Department of Food and Agriculture, we have already received demonstrations from various companies with track and trace systems and identified some potential high-level business needs for a end IT solution. To accomplish the implementation we have identified by 2018, we have broken this into 4 phases. The first phase is hiring staff necessary to promulgate regulations in the first phase. The second is developing those regulations. The third is the information technology implementation, or IT solution. The fourth and final phase is licensing and enforcement. In phase 1, we have focused on hiring. We have focused on hiring staff to draft the necessary regulations and hold stakeholder meetings. We have already been working with the Department of Finance to identify our initial resource needs and will be hiring staff over the next coming months. During the second phase, we will develop and notice the regulations. I am committed to making this process open and transparent with a focus on stakeholder engagement. My staff has already been reaching out to the public at industry events and has encouraged involvement in the development of regulations. By engaging public stakeholders before we formally notice all interested parties, we have an opportunity to provide insight and understanding of the industry and local government, and also for those parties to understand what a regulatory entity is, so there's thought sharing back and forth. Once regulations are drafted and publicly noticed, the department at that point will likely get a better understanding and a sense of our internal business requirements of a IT solution. That leads me to the third phase, members. At this point, we will focus on IT implementation. Once we have a sense of the regulatory requirements, we will quickly shift focus to implementing our new licensing system. At this point, this will include hiring additional IT staff and working with our partner licensing agencies to ensure that there is continuity across all of the licensing agencies. The last and final phase, phase 4. The department will focus on licensing and enforcement. This will include hiring staff, training and developing the licensing and enforcement staff required for this. And finally, application intake. Want to be clear, members, throughout all of these phases, I will continue to have regular updates regarding the Bureau, coordinate with our partner agencies, and communicate with this body and the public. This is a very diverse and exciting industry, and we will be working with many stakeholders to get this right. With that, let me thank this body again for allowing me the opportunity to speak, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Okay, I think as more members are coming in, we'll go ahead and hear from all panelists and then open it for questions from committee members. Mr. Houston, the Undersecretary of the Department of Food and Agriculture, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your report today.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonilla, Chairman Bonta, and Chairman Wood. I don't know if I'm close enough to hear, but Jim Houston, Undersecretary, Department of Food and Ag. Appreciate this opportunity and look forward to sort of many more of these conversations and hearings as we begin our implementation. The mission of the Department of Food and Agriculture is to protect and to promote a healthy food supply, to promote local and global trade, and a commitment to environmental stewardship. Therefore, when we looked at the marijuana legislation and our licensing requirements, we felt that we were well suited to take on that task. As many of you are aware, we certainly do a lot at the department, but one of the things we do is regulate over 400 commodities and help them. But we also have the Division of Measurement Standards, which regulates all weighing and measuring devices, which will be useful in this as well. So our first phase is, as you will sort of hear repeatedly, obviously, is to get folks hired. So we have already done that, we've already got the applications out and are requesting folks to apply, and so we're in the process of hiring folks and hope to get them on very quickly. We have sort of the 6-month budget year for this year, and then we have a budget request in next year as well. So we are requesting about 18 folks in the initial phases. Some of that is a little bit flexible with respect to IT. As Mr. Kadane insinuated, the IT development is something of an organic process, and so as we both look what's available off the shelf, we have to communicate with our other agencies and the Board of Equalization to understand sort of what all the program requirements are going to be and how they talk to each other, and so that's going to take a little bit of time. So the first thing is to get folks hired and to get the stakeholder outreach. So it's helpful to understand that what these people are going to be doing, is communicating with sister agencies, obviously, is first and foremost, because we're all sort of getting off the ground and going together. And some of these program components are very new in terms of the licenses that we have to get, but we also have existing programs that we need to understand how this program is going to interact with those. So, for instance, the nursery program. We have an existing nursery stock program in which we regulate commercial nurseries. There is a particular license under the nursery for this, but it is still nursery stock, and so it needs to be treated as nursery stock, and we need to ensure that it's free from pests, that it's free from disease, et cetera. So, these growers and nurseries are still operating as growers and nurseries. They're just growing and distributing medical cannabis. So, with respect to phase sort of 2, which would be the development of the regulations and the commensurate environmental documentation and review that is necessary. I spent some time in the legislature, and we often encountered design-build bills. And in some sense, I feel like that's what we're trying to do with the environmental and regulatory processes. So to do a programmatic environmental impact report, you have to have a program to review and to analyze. And so they are feeding off of one another. So as we develop the regulations, that feeds into the environmental documentation, but the environmental analysis is going to feed into the regulatory program because you need to understand what your mitigation is. So as you have these environmental impacts and you get to appreciate the scale and the size of what we're talking about, that's going to then feed into the regulatory program. So for instance, we have 9, technically 10 different licenses that we're allowed to give. We have 9 for growing and 1 for nurseries. So if you recall, they are, there's 3. There's sort of specialty, small, and medium, and then there is indoor, outdoor, and specialty lighting. So it respects to where you're growing it, inside or outside, what's the purpose, and what's the lighting. And so all of those things are going to have different environmental impacts associated with them. And so we have to sort of analyze what those impacts are going to be, understand that, and that may limit the amount and types of licenses that are available for folks because of the strict requirement in the bill that there be no environmental impacts, no harm to fish and wildlife, et cetera. So that sort of dialogue and process is already ongoing. We're already developing our RFP for the environmental documentation. The folks that get hired will immediately begin reaching out to stakeholders to try and understand what the regulations are going to be. Part of our very, very important stakeholders, by the way, are the ag commissioners, who we work with regularly in each county. They will be boots on the ground, and they're also a link to local governments who have a variety of ways that they are already or going to regulate this crop at the local level. So before you even get to the Department of Food and Agriculture for your license, you will have had to go through a series of steps in terms of obtaining permits at the local level, getting your water board sign off or Fish and Game sign off, whatever is appropriate, et cetera, before you come to the department. And so we have to have channels in place to be able to communicate with all those people and to do our due diligence before we issue a license. And each one of those different types of licenses is going to trigger different types of review and necessary steps. So I want to just kind of real quick go through the questions that we were asked. I wanted to give kind of a brief overview. What are the department's immediate and long-term goals? Immediately, get folks hired and get regulations started to get drafted. And long-term, I think we really appreciate and understand the importance of getting this right. That this is, a very, in some sense, historic sea change in terms of the legislation and the way that we are regulating this crop. It's got a lot of eyes and ears, focused on it, and so we want to make sure that it's functional and works from the get-go, because trying to fix stuff after it's already out the door is really hard to do. So we're certainly committed to that, and the level of communication that we have, not just with the folks at this table, but throughout state agencies and the legislature, will be extremely important to that. Our timeline is really to try and get it by January 1, 2018, as per the statute. As Mr. Kanade said, it is an ambitious time frame, and so we're trying to hit the ground running and have every intention of meeting that deadline. But that just requires us to be diligent and work fast. Make haste, not waste. It says, have you worked or plan to work with other non-licensing boards? Yes, absolutely. The level of communication, requires some degree of patience at times, just in terms of the amount of meetings that you have to have. I mean, the people are all wonderful, but you spend a lot of time meeting with different folks, especially at these beginning stages, because it's not just state, local. You've got industry associations, and then other states have very, very valuable lessons. So we've spent a lot of time trying to learn from Colorado and from Washington and from other states in terms of what they did and what strategies they employed and what lessons, really, most importantly, what lessons they learned in terms of their program. And then what are some of the challenges? I think the biggest challenge that we have is just understanding what the scope is going to be. Folks have lots of estimates about how many grows are out there, but I don't think anybody really knows, and we certainly don't know what the rate is going to be of people who are going to apply for these licenses and how many licenses we're going to be issued. But I will say that we are mindful that the better program that we can have from a user interaction standpoint, so the easier it is for folks to understand what the requirements are and how to fulfill those requirements, the more retention we're going to have. And that's what we really want. We want people to get these licenses, to want to do business with the state, and we need to have a functional program that makes sense for that to happen. But based on how many licenses we give out, that's going to have a real impact on the size of our programs. And so that's just sort of what I worry about is, do we aim too high, and then we're overloaded? Do we aim too low, and then we're crammed with applications? I think between the two, I'd rather have the former, than the latter, but that's sort of what we worry about. Thankfully, the interagency communications are really enjoyable. We've had this drilled in to us since day one of the Brown administration that we're going to break down silos and work with other agencies, and so by year 5, we're pretty good at it at this point. So it's really been a pleasure to work with my colleagues. And then what regulations do you anticipate will impact out-of-state businesses versus in-state, small versus large? The out-of-state business, is hard to say just because that's going to be, I think, from a more of a vendor type of standpoint. So for our purposes, we don't have a lot of, you're not going to be growing out of state and selling in state. So we're not going to regulate you. I think from an IT, there might be some out of state, folks who have lessons. But from a CDFA perspective, we're not as concerned about the out of state impacts as we are the small versus big. We encounter this a lot in many of our programs, and other state agencies do, which is trying to find this balance between a regulatory program that achieves its objectives, but does so in a way that doesn't prejudice small businesses. And I don't know how successful we are at hitting that mark, but that's what we're trying to do now, is to make it so that, because you have the variety and the breadth and diversity of growing operations, right? You're going to have large and small and indoor and outdoor and mixed light, urban and rural. Understanding that each of those individuals needs to be able to see a path forward in which they can obtain a license. So what are my requirements? What are my steps? Is the state making it really difficult or unnecessarily or unreasonably difficult for me to do that? And that's sort of what we want to avoid. But on the natural, bigger businesses with more sophistication at dealing with regulatory processes are probably going to have an advantage, as they do in most regulatory programs. But we're sort of mindful, like I said, of trying to make sure that we find that balance as much as we can. So that's sort of what we're prepared to do, and we are working lockstep to achieve that, and certainly stand ready to answer any questions that folks may have. So thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. And we want to welcome Dr. Karen Smith, the Director and State Public Health Officer, the Department of Public Health.
Thank you, Chair Bonta. Chair Dodd, Chair Bonta. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Karen Smith, the State Public Health Officer and Director of the California Department of Public Health. Like my colleagues, I'd like to give just a little bit of a background on the department. The California Public Health Act of 2006 actually established the California Department of Public Health within the existing Health and Human Services Agency to oversee various programs, including chronic disease prevention, family health, prevention and control of infectious diseases, environmental health, planning and response to disasters and emergencies, and licensing of healthcare facilities. The mission of the department is to optimize the health and well-being of the people of California. The Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, has as its highest priority the protection of the public. The Act mandates the Department of Public Health oversee and license medical cannabis product manufacturers and testing laboratories. We have begun the process of scoping out the regulations that are necessary and the licenses that we need to develop to ensure safe manufacturing and testing of medical cannabis products in California. The department, in beginning the process of developing regulations, has also had to address standards and procedures for licensing and inspecting, and our areas of focus at this time include standards for the production and labeling of all edible products, extraction and infusion methods and safety requirements of those, inventory procedures, quality control procedures, inspection, sanitation, and health and safety standards, standards and procedures for determining adulteration or misbranding of a product, and development of warnings about allergens. We're also establishing requirements for the testing of medical marijuana products with respect to their chemical profile and the presence of contaminants such as microbiological impurities, residual solvents, foreign materials, etc. We'll also be developing standards and procedures for the licensing of testing laboratories. Implementation of the Act, as my colleagues have said, requires very close coordination between many different departments across the state government. We've been coordinating for several months now with the Department of Consumer Affairs, the Department of Food and Ag, and others regarding the development and implementation of our regulations, including issues around the IT solutions to having a track and trace program that will follow the movement of medical marijuana throughout the entire distribution chain. Implementation of this system is extremely complex and will require substantial ongoing communication and information sharing with multiple licensing agencies. We've also begun and plan to continue working with non-licensing boards and departments, including both multi-agency coordinating meetings, for example, the State Water Resources Control Board and the Department of Fish and Game, or Fish and Wildlife, and more specific topic meetings. We've met with the Department of Pesticide Regulations, for example, in the development of maximum tolerances for pesticides in harvested cannabis. In anticipation of the January 2018 statutory deadline for development of regulations, we have begun researching the standards that will be needed for those regulations with respect to licensing, the manufacturing processes themselves, and also the labeling of cannabis products. While we have extensive expertise and experience in food manufacturing, processing, and food safety, the medical marijuana industry is new to us. We are consulting actively with our colleagues in states that have implemented regulations, standards, and procedures, both for manufacturing and testing laboratories. And we're also meeting with industry stakeholders within California, both those in manufacturing and also in the testing industries. We've visited existing facilities to try to help us better understand what the current process looks like. This information will inform our regulation development. Developing regulations, procedures, and standards for this industry is challenging, not just because it's new to us, but because it's a still evolving industry. New processes and products continuously are being developed and released. As we proceed, we will need to make a number of assumptions about how the industry will develop. These include assumptions about things as basic as the estimates of the number and types of manufacturers and testing laboratories that will require licensure. So in summary, the California Department of Public Health has considerable expertise in the oversight of manufacturing of food in California, and we are applying this expertise and experience to the safe production of medical cannabis in keeping with our mission of protecting the public's health. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you our progress and plans for implementation of the Regulation and Safety Act, and I'm also happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. With that, we will see if any members of the committee have questions on the issue of the state perspective. I'll just lead off with one quick question to Mr. Houston. In DCA, we have a system of sunset review, where basically it gives us the opportunity every 2, 3, or 4 years to come back and revisit. It allows stakeholders to give their input. And it's very useful in the licensing world to have that process. And I'm wondering if you've considered having so things aren't set in stone because it is so new. What's your plan for kind of review and flexibility moving forward around what the Department of Agriculture will be doing?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we've considered and are thinking about. You want to do your due diligence in terms of understanding how that's going to impact any sort of environmental review that's not, but yeah, we've used that in many of our programs, the similar sort of opportunity. It sort of forces folks to the table to revisit, and it provides special value in this situation because it's a new industry, and so it's certainly something that we're seriously considering. We haven't made a decision at this particular point, but I mean, it's certainly foremost in our minds.
Thank you, and I would just strongly recommend that. I think, given the success that we've had and the usefulness of this in DCA, that for all departments, it's very useful to have some system, whether you call it a sunset review or not, where licensees can also come and speak about how this is working, and changes can easily be made. Because we know one thing about government, sometimes we set things in motion and then we can't figure out how to stop it. And so building that in ahead of time can be very useful. Mr. Dodd, did you have a question? And we'll
yeah, a couple of them here. Mr. Kidani, are you going to plan on doing appointing an advisory committee?
Appreciate that question, Chair Dodd. Absolutely. The importance of an advisory committee is they're the subject matter experts and they are the direct representatives of the multiple representatives of the stakeholders. It is no different than advisory committees that I already have in place for some of my larger bureaus, private post-secondary, my Bureau for Security and Investigative Services. Both serve a very important role. Go to those advisory committees to get information, feedback on very contentious issues, and I can see that playing out here.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Smith, I'm wondering who you're looking at for testing. Would CDFA's lab be something to be appropriate, good fit for testing here?
Well, we'll be, in our environmental health lab, we'll be testing a little bit of the product just to assure that the standards of the testing laboratories are working. So most of the testing will be done in licensed testing laboratories that meet certain requirements for capability and consistency. In terms of testing the plant around pesticide residues in particular, that's still under discussion, and I don't believe that we've made any specific determinations about that yet.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. This is directed to Mr. Houston, but I invite the other panelists to share as well if you've done the same thing. You'd mentioned that you had been studying and reviewing the experience in Colorado for lessons learned that you may be able to apply. Can you just identify some of the top ones that you are really incorporating into your plans? And I don't know if Ms. Smith or Mr. Kadani have also had a chance to be looking at what Colorado is experiencing. If you can comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that we've learned from the Colorado experience is the importance of having sort of the track and trace system workable and somewhat malleable, I guess, in terms of, you need folks to be able to interact with it at the ground level and understand it. It needs to be secure so that it can't be, but not, hacked. I don't know that. I don't try and sound like a techie or something, but it needs to be secure so folks can't manipulate it. For instance, the unique identifier itself is something that we need to be mindful as we're creating it, that it's got security protocols. Where do you house it? Just like where do we put these things, these physical identifiers? Because normally when you think of a zip tie, that's not something that you think of. But because they have such an importance and because there will be technology, there's going to be an incentive to try and manipulate the system. So to try and get ahead of that with security protocols, I think is the most important thing. But also, other agencies have to interact with it. So, both DCA, Department of Public Health, the water boards, law enforcement, local governments, all have a part to play. So having that flexibility to talk with different systems. All of these, there's lots of databases out there, and they're all in sort of different codes and languages, which, I'm not proficient in, but thankfully there are people that are. But they need to be able to talk to each other. And so that's one of the things that we need to be mindful of and get ahead of, is just understanding the breadth of the challenge ahead of us.